So I'm going to start by, I've done the other ones, I'm going to start by trying to do this wood grain effect. And I just made it a 1000 by 1000 pixel square in Photoshop. And the first part of the instructions says to just use the paintbrush tool and create, this basic lines of different grays. So I'm just going to start, I'm going to pick a gray, and I'm going to make sure that I don't have any color in my gray. I'm going to pull it all the way to the side, and I'm just going to pick a random gray, and I'll pick my paintbrush tool, and I'll start by making some bigger marks. And I have my paintbrush set to hardness 100. Maybe I'll set it actually at 0 so that I can make some nice kind of just lines like that. Now let's make some much bigger marks. We can really, be a little more bold with it. Okay, now let's switch to maybe a darker. Again, I pull it all the way to the side there. Okay, so now I think maybe one more in the middle there. Maybe make that bigger. Kind of just go over that. Okay, there. Now I'm going to go into my smudge tool. Okay, so the smudge tool is this little finger right here, which you might have it set on the blur tool, but you just have to press and hold, click and hold, and you can then use the smudge tool. And it's very similar to the liquefy tool. It works like a paintbrush, but basically it allows you to kind of click and drag, and blend things out. Let's make that brush stroke bigger, and see how we can kind of create these sort of more organic kind of smudgy lines. And that's the idea. I'm just going to skip ahead and do a little bit more off camera. Next step is to now apply a filter, which is a noise filter. So if I click on filter and go down to noise and add noise, and I'm going to choose Gaussian. You can see that. Now you can just try the other one to see the difference, Gaussian versus uniform. And I can add more or less. I think that's probably a little too much there. I'm probably going to add about 20% or so. And you can see that, yeah, I'm not a big fan of the blur or the noise filter, because it tends to get really like this. If I crank it all the way up, everything would look like that. But I think if you're judicious with it, yeah, let's do like 23% there. It can look okay, and that's pretty similar to this. Again, you can just see that really the difference is that I didn't quite model mine after the original with the same kind of lines and same kind of contrast. Now I could add some other things to affect it. I can go back to my smudge tool, in fact, and let's just for laughs, let's see what that does. And that kind of brings it back into that kind of weird sort of place. I don't know that that's really helping in any way, so I would undo that. Other things you can do is, we could go into layer styles. I'm not going to do that because I'll do that on the other ones. One thing I like to play around with are adjustment layers over here. And my favorite one is curves, and you'll see with the curves adjustment layer you get this little panel here, and this allows you to adjust the contrast, but very specifically the lights and the darks. The middle right here is the absolute middle of values. I can make the whole thing lighter or darker, and I can also adjust just the highlights. I can make the highlights lighter, and you'll see that it actually affects the whole thing. It's a little tricky actually here. I can make the darks darker, the highlights brighter, the whole thing a little brighter. So I can get a lot of different effects here. But if I wanted it to be more like what that one was, I could actually do this. And now we're getting a little closer to what that one looked like in the original. Maybe something like that. Again, my lines aren't the same size. But that's something I almost always do an adjustment layer of curves, just because it allows me to play around a little bit. So that's the basic, way you can create a texture just from scratch. Now I'm going to look at some other ones that I did based on this. Let's look at this next one here, my version. Not quite the same, but I use the same process. Again, you'll see that in my post, the description. I'm just going to show you that. So this one is my version of the second top right panel here. And basically, yeah, you just create this background using a gradient, which the gradient tool is here. Sometimes it's the paint bucket tool. Oops, can't see that. The label's covering it. But you choose gradient. There you go. You can see the paint bucket. And then you just create a gradient on your layer, which kind of looked like that, and then you apply the bas relief, but the bas relief doesn't really do much. I don't quite understand the point of that. You can do a lot with bas relief and other effects, and I'll show you some of that. But the main thing is you do a bunch of brush strokes, which I did just black and white brush strokes, and then you add what's called the layer styles, and you can get those up here under layer. Where are they? Layer styles. And you'll see I have drop shadow and bevel and emboss selected, but you also see them over here in the layers panel. And if I click on it, or double click on it, it'll bring up this little panel here called the layer style panel. And you can see that if you check or uncheck, it does the effect. In this case, here's the drop shadow. Now if you actually click not on the box but on the word, it brings up a separate panel and it gives you a whole bunch of more adjustments, and you can see what they do. And you really just kind of have to play around with this and get used to it. The blend mode is very important, normal versus multiply. You can see that multiply makes things a little darker. You have opacity, you can make it, more opaque or less opaque. You can see how that affects it. The distance is how far away the shadow is from the source, which is in this case the brush strokes. And the spread is kind of how far that spreads. It's kind of similar to distance, but it has to do more with not the distance away from it, but the width of it, I guess is a better way. So, I'm sorry, size actually is really more about the distance here. I'll show you what I mean. If or rather how big it is, how big the shadow is. There it completely covers it. Here it's getting a little less. Now spread is actually how thick. It's really kind of hard to explain. But you can see how playing around with these together will give you different effects, and of course make the opacity more, change the blend mode to multiply, different effects. So that's drop shadow. I typically I'm not very fond of drop shadow so much. I like things like inner shadow, which, you can play around with that one yourself. Same with outer glow, although outer glow you'll see has a color selected, and you're going to want to change that. But again, you'll have to explore these on your own rather. And bevel and emboss, a very powerful one. And just for laughs, I'm going to turn all these off so you can see just what I did. I mean, that's all I did. Bunch of squiggles overlapping each other, thicker, thinner, different colors, different grays. Again, no color, different grays. But let's put those back on again. So bevel and emboss, you have inner bevel versus outer bevel, smooth, hard. I mean, you can get some really different effects, different depths. You really just want to play around with these. Emboss, I mean, there's some nice effects, but remember that they're very sort of standard digital effects, and this is a very familiar look. So you want to play around with it and make it look like your own kind of thing. Here I'm just going to really play with this. I kind of like what I'm doing here, actually. No, I just lost what I had. It looks so good. There we go. I think the soften is no good. I like that. That hard effect and really increase the depth. So anyway, I mean, you really have a lot of possibilities here that you can play around with. And you'll see now my version, very different than the original version, but using similar effects. It's really just a matter of creating some kind of pattern or lines, and we can use some of these things ourselves, just creating our own sort of style. Have something in mind. That kind of helps. But try not to use just a pre-planned sort of effect without a whole lot of you doing anything to it. This is a fairly unique texture. It doesn't look like all the other ones. This one I didn't think was so great. Let's take a quick look at that one. But you can see it looks fairly similar. And again, I used drop shadow and bevel and emboss, and you can do so much with those just by clicking on that bevel and emboss. There's also the contour. Let's look at that tool. You can change the contour. You can choose these, the way that the contour of the bevel and emboss is affecting it. Straight line, curved line around, double curve, staggered. All of these things have different effects. Then there's also texture, which sounds very good, but you also have to be aware that the patterns that come pre-built are, one of them's color, which is kind of not good. And again, I'm not real fond of these, but you play around with scale, and you might get some effects that are interesting. I tend to think that most of these end up looking very digital, and they don't look very real. And my preference is to really do more with images and parts of images, as you can see in the next tutorial. But you should get used to how to work with these various tools. Layer styles are very, very powerful, and I'm not even going to get into these other ones. You want to add satin effect. I mean, there's so many different things, and you should explore them and kind of get a different feeling for it. But the end result is that you really want to create a texture that really has a three-dimensional quality to it and a three-dimensional feeling. And it doesn't necessarily have to be realistic, but it should refer to some sense of, illusionistic, reality, I guess. Or, make us feel the tactile quality so that it feels as though it's something you could touch, whether or not it's real. You should get used to how to work with these various tools. Layer styles are very, very powerful, and I'm not even going to get into these other ones. You want to add satin effect. I mean, there's so many different things, and you should explore them and kind of, get a different feeling for it. But the end result is that you really want to create a texture that really has a three-dimensional quality to it and a three-dimensional feeling. And it doesn't necessarily have to be realistic, but it should refer to some sense of, illusionistic, reality, I guess, or make us feel the tactile quality so that it feels as though it's something you could touch, whether or not it's real. So that's really what you want to focus on. Create a quick gradient. Again, the gradient is right where the paint bucket tool is. You choose that and you click and drag a line, and it creates a gradient. Now I'm going to go to Filter, Render Clouds. Yeah, you'll see that's created actually little higher contrast clouds. And these are a nice sort of starting point to do a texture. But the problem is, again, they kind of look like the same. You might even think, oh, this is a good texture, I'm done. No, because everybody can just click clouds and there it is. That's what I call a one-button solution. So now I'm going to just try Filter, and I'm going to go to, where am I? Sketch Bas Relief. And you'll see that this is a very simple but exciting effect. You can put your detail all the way up. Yours might be down here. The smoothness might be up here. It can be very different depending on what you want to do. I'm going to put the smoothness at 2, and I'm going to really crank the detail all the way up. And the problem with this is, yeah, it's a real nice texture, but it's always the same. It always looks like stone and or aluminum foil. So I'd like to see you be a little more sophisticated with it. Again, this is, okay, it's not a one-button solution, it's a two-button solution. What more can you do with this? Well, one thing that is suggested a lot of times is to duplicate the layer. You can click on the layer and bring it to New Layer, and it makes a new background copy layer. Make sure you're on that layer. Do something different to it, Let's add another filter. Let's do the bas relief again. If I just hit that, boy, ooh, horrible, right? Well, maybe not. That's kind of a nice texture too. But what happens if I turn the opacity down? And this is where you start to get some different kinds of effects as you play with opacity. You could try layer styles, or if you click on Bevel and Emboss, all it does is affect the very edge. It sees this as one shape, like one brush stroke. So Bevel and Emboss and the various layer styles, they affect usually the edges of the shape. So if your shape is not like a brush stroke that has clear edges all the way around, if it's just an entire image that covers the whole thing, it's really not going to do much. So that's probably not a good choice. You might try some other things like, well, we could try to do some more noise as we tried before. We could try something like the Gaussian blur, or rather the Gaussian noise filter. The Gaussian blur is something else. We could try that as well. And we can see what's underneath, and see how that works. Again, play with the opacity a little bit. But anyway, you get the idea. Try different things. I'm going to really leave it up to you.